Hello watch enthusiasts! Now in today's video I'd like to speak about a few releases over the past month, which I think were very interesting in terms of giving something very new to the market, but also in terms of being something other than the SIHH releases which I've spoken about. And these releases range from everything from news from the Swatch group regarding their use of springs, all the way through to a very innovative new tag Hoya, as well as an interesting release from Oris, and also some interesting designs from both Belden, Ross and Omega. Now the first piece of news to speak about is a development from the Swatch group, and the Swatch group has been seeing quite a great deal of change over the past year, bearing in mind that it won't be appearing at Baselworld this year. However, they have arranged events at the same time for the releases of their watches, and so we will see watches being released at essentially the same time, which creates an interesting dilemma, I suppose, and I would consider this as an interesting moment for those who want to cover the event. But anyway, the change which I'd like to speak about today is their announcement about their springs, or indeed their balance springs, which are going to be used in future. Because the Swatch group has now announced that in future, all Swatch movements, all Swatch mechanical movements that is, will feature anti-magnetic hairsprings. Now it's worth noting that at the present time, most Swiss-made movements, which are of a certain quality, normally have a 60 Gauss anti-magnetic rating, that's 4800 amperes per metre. And that's seen as a generally very acceptable level of anti-magnetism, though won't resist exposure to direct magnetic fields. It tends to be able to deal with ambient magnetism perfectly fine. But here they're going a step further and in many ways following Omega's lead by using fully anti-magnetic springs which are completely unaffected by magnetism. And so they'll be rolling this out in two ways. So firstly, silicon, which is already being used by Omega for their 15,000 Gauss anti-magnetic watches, and has been extremely stable and very functional with that brand, is going to be rolled out, as I would imagine, in their higher end models. Because the two types of springs they're going to be using are silicon, whilst the other, which is less expensive and is a new development for the Swatch group and Audemars Piguet, is Nivachron. And Nivachron is a cheaper alternative, essentially, to using a silicon spring, and it's believed that it's a titanium-based alloy, though, of course, the composition of it hasn't been announced because it is a trade secret. But in this sense, that will be a more affordable alternative and will find its way into all of the Swatch group brands, no matter how inexpensive they are. So even the Swatch System 51 will get a Nivachron spring, whilst if you look to higher-end brands, like for example Breguet, they will be using those silicon springs instead. Now the first watch I'd like to speak about in its own right is a new version of the Oris Aquis. And the Oris Aquis is a watch which has been around for quite a while and has come in a variety of different variations, and certainly Oris is certainly not new to the limited editions of watches, but usually Oris have a very good range of limited editions in terms of being pieces which sponsor very worthy causes. And this edition, which is the Oris Aquis date relief, is no exception to that rule. And just speaking about what similarities it has with the normal Aquis, this piece is 43.5mm as with the normal Aquis, and has the same case with these brushed flanks and polished elements also on it, for example those short stubby integrated lugs. It also has the same sort of bezel action with the 120 clicks, and also the same crown design with those screwed-on crown guards. Naturally, it comes with the same style of strap, where you can have either a rubber strap, a leather strap, or a metal bracelet, but they are all proprietary, and so you do have to have the Oris equivalents, which is annoying for some, but I think if you appreciate the quality of the Oris-provided versions, then it's perfectly fine to use them. Internally, the watch uses the Oris Calibre 733, which is essentially a Sellita SW200, which has been minorly modified by Oris, so it doesn't have much decoration, but does have their proprietary red rotor, and of course keeps the same 38-hour power reserve running at 4Hz with 26 joules, but they do have the instant date change on this movement, which is a nice feature to see, because it means the date changes instantly at 12 o'clock, or rather midnight, instead of taking about an hour or so on some movements to change, which is a helpful feature in terms of having a much more crisp and clean demonstration of what the actual date is. And to understand the various parts of this watch which have changed, one has to look at the inspiration for the piece, which was designed to be inspired by the feeling and the appearance of water, rather than the sea or, for example, coral, as has been the case with some of their other limited editions. Because this piece retains the 300-metre water resistance of the standard watch, and so as a result is very much a professional dive watch. But it's designed to raise awareness for the perils that one faces in the future with regards to contamination of the world's water supply. Interestingly, this project also supports Ernst Bromheis's plan to swim across the Lake Baikal in Russia, which is the largest freshwater lake in the world, and thus again celebrates this cause of fresh water around the world, where normally these Aquis ranges and limited editions tend to be inspired by the saltwater oceans and seas around the world. And really it's that inspiration which has gone into the design of this watch, and so the dial with its hand-applied faceted indices is this sort of stormy colour of grey with this sunburst effect to mimic the surface of the waters, whilst gone is the ceramic bezel insert on the usual watch, and in its place is a steel insert. And the reason for this is to give that somewhat frosted appearance to the surface of water with this frosted steel, as you can see, with these brushed, raised elements on top of it to show the markings for being used as a dive insert. Then one also has a loomed marker at 12 o'clock, and the red second hand is a touch to celebrate, or rather to raise awareness for the urgency of the current situation. And this piece is going to be released for a limited period of time, but isn't actually going to be a limited edition in the conventional sense of a certain number of pieces being sold, and the price for this watch will be between 1,750 and 1,950 Swiss francs, depending upon whether you go for a leather strap or a rubber strap, or if you go for the full metal bracelet. This next piece I'd like to speak about comes from Bellem Ross, and it's a timepiece which is very heavily inspired by the aviation world, and most importantly by the radio compass gauges which were attached to the dashboards of aircraft. And the inspiration for this is rather an obvious one, because it does have those 4 screws which are so prominent on the BR03 line. But this is a watch which I think has a very interesting case material, as well as a build which is both impressive in terms of being very different in terms of design, but also being highly legible, highly functional, and also I think surprisingly good value, considering what often is the case with Bellem Ross watches, where they don't offer quite the value that one sees from other brands. And the watch in question is the Bellem Ross BR03-92 Bicompass, a watch which offers a very interesting design, but which is quintessentially Bellem Ross, and so is extremely recognisable. And this piece is a limited edition of 999 pieces, inspired, as I've said, by those radio compasses. And so it keeps the general build of the BR03 with the 42mm by 42mm square case, with those lugs which jut out from the sides, and also those 4 screws which are seen going through the case, and which give that appearance of being a dial or a gauge in a cockpit of an aircraft. And the watch has 100 metre water resistance, and is designed very much to have this stealth appearance to it, and is built in black ceramic, which is something which one doesn't normally see at this sort of price range, but bead-blasted black ceramic does give an extremely high scratch resistance, and makes the watch an interesting choice if you want something which doesn't quite have the knock resistance or the shock resistance of steel, but gives you this appearance which will last. Then one has raised above this a circular element, and of course the dial is circular. But the detailing on the dial I think is phenomenal, because one sees several levels on the dial, with a lower level which is coloured with this blue luminova showing the hours. And here you see the 12, 3, 6 and 9 in superluminova, but in this blue coloration, with that central ring which is a disc which runs off what normally the hour hand would run off. And so this allows that central section of the dial with its marker painted to it to rotate independently and show you the hours. Then raised above this you have this chapter ring with both the Bellem Ross signature and also the graduations for the minutes and the seconds. And this is finished with luminova in this off-white cream sort of tone, with a yellowish sort of tone to it. And this runs around the edge of the dial and has this interesting beveled edge with those individual markings for the minutes and the seconds, which slopes down towards the dial, which itself has this sloped edge also added to the date aperture, which is placed at the 4:30 position, and has this nice rounded edge to match the matte black date wheel with its matching cream markings. And I think from its beveled edges around the case to its extremely well detailed crown, and that wonderful choice of second hand which doesn't have a counterweight in order to give it this sense of being an aeroplane dial or gauge instead of simply being a second hand, is really very, very interesting. Whilst the movement inside this watch is the Calibre BR-CAL.302, which, whilst having a rather long and Bellem Ross proprietary name, is based on the Sleater SW300-1, and so is an automatic 42-hour power reserve 4Hz watch with 25 joules. And the price for this watch is €3,500, which, whilst a relatively high price for an ETA or Sleater based movement design, I think the other features of the watch make this a really interesting package. Certainly the fact the case is ceramic, and also simply having this limited edition of 999 pieces with this thoroughly interesting detailing on the dial, and this general design is really an interesting point, and I think makes this watch quite an attractive watch even at that sort of price range, and I think presents a certain degree of value. Now the next piece I'd like to speak about is a new version of the Seamaster 300M from Omega. And this is a watch which provides a very different sort of interpretation of the line, and provides it in a ceramic no-date configuration. And before I give my personal views on this particular watch, I think it's worth going through the specifications and explaining what this watch really is. Because where the normal Seamaster 300M remains 42mm, indeed in its evolved and rather grown size from last year's update of the watch, this watch grows to 43.5mm, and so does become 1.5 millimeters wider. Also, the material has changed, because now, in addition to having a ceramic bezel, the mid-case, so that's the lugs and the general case of the watch, is now black ceramic, but retains the same finishes as the standard watch, with brushing on the sides and then some polished bevels as well. And then there are also fixtures in titanium, so the bezel, as well as the crown, the helium escape valve and the case back, are grade 5 titanium. And the grade 5 titanium provides the ability to have it polished in certain areas, rather than simply remaining a very matte, bead-blasted effect, as is so often the case with grade 2 titanium, and so one gets a slightly more luxurious interpretation of this use of the material. Where the dial is concerned, everything has grown somewhat, as a result of this watch growing in size, but also the date has been removed from the watch in this case. The hands also remain this evolved and enlarged size as of last year, and all colour has been purged from the dial, so there's no longer a red Seamaster logo. It is all monochromatic, but still with those engraved stripes or waves in the surface of the dial which run across this ceramic base to the dial. Inside the watch, the same movement is seen, with the Calibre 8806 with a 55-hour power reserve, running at 3.5 Hz with 35 joules, and of course there's a master coaxial chronometer, which means you can have an exhibition case back and still retain the 15,000 Gauss anti-magnetism this watch is rated to. And my feelings about this watch are rather mixed, because on the one hand I think it's a very interesting reinterpretation of the Seamaster 300, and I think creates a very different area of the lineup, away from the steel and precious metal versions of the 300M. But on the other hand, I feel this watch is perhaps barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, with what the Seamaster 300M should be. And by this I mean that when one thinks of a large Seamaster from Omega, with a high water resistance, a professional sort of build, and especially ceramic, one thinks of the Planet Ocean as that more butch and more robust sort of counterpart. The 300M has always been a more dressy alternative, something with a slightly wider appeal, and design which can be worn just as easily under a suit as in a wetsuit. But I feel this watch loses that appeal because of this ceramic build and the larger size. Similarly, the choice of having no date on this watch feels more forced than deliberate. And the reason why I say this is because, unlike the Planet Ocean range, which used the larger 8900 movement, with some different features as well, most notably the movement of the hour hand independently of the other hands, the 8800 line of movements, of which the 8806 in this watch is one, is a smaller size movement used in some smaller watches, and which has been used across the Omega range, but isn't quite the same diameter as the 8900. And I fear that the use of this movement in this watch meant that to put a date on this watch would have not worked in the first place, because if you put a date on this watch in the correct place on the movement, it would find itself much closer to the centre of the dial, and thus would appear out of balance. And so I can't help but feel, whether this is right or wrong, that the choice to not have a date on this watch was more forced than deliberate as a stylistic change. And then of course there's the question of ceramic as a whole, because I feel that ceramic is a material which, granted, is extremely scratch resistant, but is not very resilient to bumps, and with a sharp knock, as has been seen on certain Panerais, for example, one can quite easily shatter a lug. And I think with a watch which is going to be used in slightly more active circumstances than, say, an Omega Speedmaster, I feel it's not really the material I would choose if I wanted to go for a robust sports watch. But whatever your opinion on this watch is, and I'd be very curious to hear what your opinion is down below, this watch is 7,500 Swiss francs plus tax. Now the penultimate piece I'd like to speak about is a new model from TAG Heuer. And I think it's a model which does demonstrate TAG Heuer's interest in modernising and looking towards the future. And the watch in question is the TAG Heuer Carrera Calibre Hoya O2T Tourbillon Nanograph. And whilst that's quite a mouthful in terms of names, I think there's a great deal to talk about with this timepiece, and it does demonstrate a very interesting future for TAG Heuer, and also their Tourbillon chronographs, of which they've released some in the past, at some incredible prices considering the engineering and the technology going into them, as well as the usual price for a tourbillon watch. And the watch comes in the form of a 45mm diameter sports watch, with a chronograph sort of layout, as is the case, of course, with the Carrera design. And the watch comes in an interesting material which is far from steel. Instead, they've used a combination, a mix of titanium throughout the case, as well as this forged style of carbon, which is very much the inspiration of this watch, as they really do make this watch revolve around carbon as a key component of a timepiece. And it gives this fantastic and somewhat unique appearance to the surface of the watch, and gives it this shifting and very interesting look. Of course, one key element to the design of this watch is that hexagonal pattern, which is seen throughout that skeletonized dial, as well as on elements of the crown and on some parts of the movement. The build of the watch case also gives this watch 100 meter water resistance, which does add to the sports watch credentials of the piece. But really, when speaking about this watch, what's really interesting is the movement. Because this watch uses the Calibre 02T, and so this is an evolution of the Calibre 02 used in for example, the new Heuer Otavia. Because this watch features a column wheel automatic chronograph which is in-house from TAG Heuer, and provides them with this 4Hz chronograph with that very attractive layout of subdials on the horizontal axis of the dial rather than being vertical like a Veltri 7750. And this gives the watch a very crisp engagement and function to the chronograph thanks to that column wheel, but of course with the T version of this watch one has the addition of a tourbillon placed at 6 o'clock in the place of the running seconds. And you'll notice this watch also has this skeletonized appearance with a blacked out movement, and you can see this through the dial and also through the case back, through which you can also see the rotor for automatic winding, which is also skeletonized with certain hexagonal details. And the reason for these is due to the technology which has been incorporated into the balance spring of this watch. And the balance spring of this watch is made up of a carbon lattice. And what's interesting about this watch is it's one of the first serially produced timepieces to feature this sort of technology, and does mark a real advance for TAG Heuer as a technological innovator. And I think from their previous tourbillon chronographs, one can see they are aiming for a value product, but certainly aren't skimping on the quality in this example. And in this watch the technology is paired with an aluminium balance, which allows the watch to both have a low inertia balance, but also gives the ability to have a watch which is extremely resilient to temperature change, which is something you wouldn't normally be able to protect against to the degree this watch is able to resist it. And this watch, interestingly, is not going to be produced in a limited edition, but rather will be a serially produced watch, and will be $25,000 US. Now the final piece I'd like to speak about is not a single watch, but rather three. Because this year 2019 has been celebrated by many as the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, but rather fewer people have associated it with the 50th anniversary of the Zenith El Primero, and by extension, the 50th anniversary of the automatic chronograph. And of course, in that first wave of watches in 1969, one can see three watches which rise to prominence. Firstly, there was the Seiko 6139, in addition to the Zenith El Primero, and also the Calibre 11, which was a collaboration between a number of brands including Hoya, as well as Hamilton and Buren. And so with this year of great innovation, we're unsure as to which actually came first. Some rumours say that the Seiko hit the market before the other two, whilst one of them was developed before the other, but in truth, one can never be sure of which one actually was released first. But certainly what one knows is that the El Primero was a very major, and certainly the most accomplished and luxurious of those three movements released, with the Seiko movement being more utilitarian, the Calibre 11 being more of a hodgepodge of different movements stuck together, whilst the El Primero is very much a movement in its own right. And so for this 50th anniversary, Zenith have released this trio box set of three watches which celebrate the line. And to provide some context, with this box set, which costs $50,000 US, one receives a miniature watchmaker's desk with a magnifying glass and a light, but also a particular movement part which, if you buy this, you're invited to come and stamp in Switzerland at the factory. And you'll stamp two, one of which will end up in the Zenith exhibit in order to celebrate the El Primero, and the other you get to take home. And the general premise of the watch box is that you're able to see three evolutionary stages of the El Primero, with the first being the original, the second being 1/10 of a second, and the third being 1/100th of a second, whilst there is a spare slot in the box for a future release which may well take place of a 1,000th of a second chronograph. And the first of the three watches in the box is an almost exact replica of the original 1969 watch, the A386, complete with 38mm case fitting with the original, and also a sunburst effect brushing on the top of the lugs, giving a delicate but really thoroughly beautiful look to the watch. The dial is also period correct with this silvered appearance, and also with that decimal graduation in black around the outside of the dial, and then a tachymeter as well. Typically one sees those three colours for the subdials which overlap, as well as the cunning placement of the date at 4:30, in addition to the second hand being in red with that paddle shape. And then in terms of movements, one sees a movement which is as close to the original as one can get in modern El Primeros, and so it uses the El Primero 400, which is an evolution of the original Calibre 3019 PHC. And that movement hasn't changed a great deal since its introduction, which is a testament to the quality and the design, but has been developed with a few advantages and a few tweaks, and so it still runs at the high beat rate of 5 Hz or 10 ticks a second, and has a 50-hour power reserve with a column wheel. The second watch in the box grows to 42mm, but remains the same stainless steel as its predecessor. It develops a more finely faceted case with longitudinal brushing along it, and also changes somewhat in terms of design. And this watch is the Chronomaster 21 El Primero, and it's designed to celebrate the El Primero striking 10th from 2010. And that watch was the first El Primero to feature 1/10th of a second graduations, which meant that one had a central second hand which rotated around the dial once every 10 seconds rather than once every 60. And so one also had a normal second counter on the one of the subdials for the chronograph, so that you could keep track of the standard timing, but just get a more accurate reading. And this didn't increase the beat rate of the movement at all, but rather it was geared to be able to provide this additional function. And whilst the first watch I showed is much closer to the original, this piece steps away from its inspirational model, which was of course that striking 10th, because this watch features a redesigned dial, where in fact one no longer has the 1/10th of a second graduations within the dial, but rather it's now placed on a ceramic bezel, which is placed around the crystal. Also, the indices have been moved somewhat around the dial, as well as those subdials being replaced and repositioned, with their arrangement overlapping in a different way, and so it's an interesting balance between the striking 10th and the original El Primero. And the calibre which is used inside this is the Calibre 3600, which is used exclusively in this watch, and runs a 60-hour power reserve at 5 Hz, and like the striking 10th, it doesn't actually have a higher beat rate to be able to run that faster second hand, but rather is simply geared to do so. It also does have a column wheel, and provides a very interesting balance in the middle of this range of 3 which you're provided with in that box set. And the final watch in this set is the Zenith Defy El Primero 21, a timepiece which was released relatively recently in terms of being released a couple of years ago, but which has been produced in this exclusive model just for this set, and comes in titanium in a 44mm case, with this semi-skeletonized dial, but with these fully built subdials in those traditional colours of the original. They're also overlapped in the way the original subdials are, but of course the whole rest of the case is very modern Zenith, and one has a design and movement which is truly groundbreaking. And I've said this before, but I will say it again, I think for around the £10,000 mark this is a truly remarkable watch in its standard offering, and I think if someone were looking for a watch in this sort of price range with an interesting chronograph function, then really look no further, because this is a fascinating alternative to something like a Rolex Daytona with what is, I think, a much finer movement in terms of its functionality. But really what's impressive about this watch, aside from the fact that it's taken from earlier designs and made the whole package very elegant, is the movement. Because this watch uses the El Primero 21 movement, which is distinctly different from the movement which was used in the Chronomaster 21, because rather than running at 36,000 vibrations per hour, this watch actually has 2 separate escapements. One runs at 36,000 vibrations per hour for the normal timekeeping of the watch, whilst the other runs at 50 Hz, which is 10 times that beat rate of 360,000 vibrations per hour, which is an incredibly high beat rate, in order to allow that second hand to rotate once around the dial per second. Now crucially, this brings on 2 interesting technological details of this watch. Firstly, that it uses carbon springs in the for the balances, and this is in a way similar to that Tag Heuer I just showed you, because a normal spring simply wouldn't be able to survive the sort of abuse and be able to work within the tolerances you would need for this watch. Also, the power reserve indicator at 12 is for the chronograph, not for the watch itself, and this is because the chronograph section will drain its power supply in 50 minutes whilst engaged. And whilst this may seem like a very short period of time, the beat rate it's running at is so incredibly high that it's unsurprising that this is the case, and so you have to wind it up in the process. But I think overall this is an incredibly interesting watch, and as an independent piece from this collection, I think it's a very interesting model to own as well. And so the price for this set of 3 comes in at $50,000 US, which, whilst a significant sum of money, also gives you the option to go to the factory, where you can engrave a particular pair of parts, one of which is kept and used for an exhibit, and the other which you get to keep. And so it creates an interesting sense of involvement with the history of the El Primero. And whilst, of course, this is a significant sum of money, I think if someone is a real collector and is in the market for this sort of thing, I think this is a very well-executed sort of idea for Zenith. Anyway, I'll conclude the video there, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of these watches, and indeed their various attributes, because I'm always curious to hear what you think of the pieces I feature. And if you did enjoy the video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm the Watch Guy, out.